So
they're online.
Okay, now we are transmitting through YouTube. And how many of us are now participating? 15. So Christy, whenever you said, I will start with the session and so on.
You can start right now.
Okay. So thank you very much to everyone for joining us in the second and last day of Magdalena's celebration, or AKA Medina Fest. And it is my great pleasure and honor to moderate the first two sessions of this event, especially when I have to introduce first to her professor, Dr. Rudolf Klein, who is going to contribute to this event, and to whom I think we all here owe in some way, especially the Mexican community in Soft Matter, our gratitude and admiration. Professor Klein is an emeritus professor of theoretical physics in the University of Constance in Germany, and had one of the most prolific and outstanding careers. For those here in Mexico working, or everywhere working in soft matter, he's the author, together with Hess, of one of the most cited and important reviews in soft matter. And he was also the promoter of brilliant scientists in our community or field, such as Sausin Chen, Phil Pincus, Alice Gast, and of course Magdaleno himself, who considered Professor Klein a mentor and a close friend. And just briefly, I will say that the importance of this relationship between Magdaleno and Professor Klein can be hardly overstated, considering the amount of Mexican researchers, including many in this event, that worked closely with him and his group, including Ramon himself, Honorina Ruiz, that sadly is not here, Jose Mendez, and other ones. And Professor Klein, although only virtually, it is a great honor to meet you, and thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you. Now, how can we do it that that I am on the big screen? What do I have to do?
Share screen, I will say. To share your presentation?
Oh, this is not.
There is a green thing on the bottom which says share screen or something like that.
Herr Klein, wenn Sie Ihren Cursor nach unten gehen, dann findet Sie ein grünes Quadrat, da steht Bildschirm freigeben. Sehen Sie das? Ja. Da klicken Sie drauf.
Aha, jetzt bin
da klicken Sie drauf und dann können Sie Ihr PowerPoint-File aufmachen. Sie wollen ein PowerPoint-File zeigen? You want to show a PowerPoint file, right?
Nein, ich möchte nur, dass Sie mich sehen.
We see you. We see you.
So wie ich Sie jetzt sehe.
Ja, we see you.
Aber ich dachte, dass vielleicht dieses Share Screen war das Problem oder so.
Hallo.
Hi, Stefan.
Okay, so Magdaleno is he around?
Yep. Yes, I'm actually sharing the screen with the moderator because we are in the same place. So I'm here and I'm very happy to see you.
It is nice to be part of this special event to celebrate your 70th birthday. First of all, congratulations. I wish you all the best for the future, in particular, good health, an open mind, and good friends.
Thank you.
This is not a guarantee for a good life, but it helps.
Oh, yeah.
When I heard about your birthday, my mind went back to the past to figure out when we first met. It was in the beginning of the 1980s, which means 40 years ago. 40 years.
Yeah.
You had finished your PhD, went back to Mexico, you worked at Sinvestav, and I presume that you tried to get into contact with other scientists who were interested in colloids. Let me say a few words to describe the situation of our field in the 1970s, which might be of interest to the younger colleagues in the audience. At that time, only very few physicists worked in this area. Terms like colloid physics and soft condensed matter were still unknown. We talked about complex fluids, and most experimental work was performed by physical chemists and chemical engineers. What we did was interdisciplinary research. We used well-developed concepts of statistical physics and experimental as well as theoretical tools to explore properties of systems which were not at the center of interest in physics. 40 years ago, there was, at least in Germany, a rather deep separation between physics and chemistry. But on the other hand, there was great freedom in choosing an area of research once one had reached the position of full professor. My own interest in the field of soft matter dates back to around 1970, when I had learned that it is possible to determine the size and shape of a macromolecule in solution by light scattering. So when I moved to Constance in 1972, my main interest continued to be in solid-state physics, but when I got into contact with biologists in Constance, I began with one doctoral student to work on Brownian motion. And this student was Walter Hess. It was much easier to obtain funds for students by writing proposals on dynamics of interacting Brownian particles instead of dynamics of colloidal suspensions, which is of course the same, but for the people who have to decide about funding a physicist, the interacting Brownian particles are of course much more interesting. In the early years, it was advisable to hide the colloids behind an interesting application of statistical physics. This might be also the case for you, Magdaleno. My recollections of the genesis of the long-lasting collaboration with Magdaleno and the number of his students is connected with a conference which was held in Berlin in June 1982. The title was Ionic Liquids, Molten Salts, and Polyelectrolytes.
Yeah.
Charge-stabilized colloids played only a minor role. Afterwards, we began to visit each other. I attended the Mexican School on Statistical Physics in Oaxtepec in August 1985, and Magdaleno came. Oh. And Magdaleno came in 1986 with his family to Constance for a whole year with a fellowship from the, I don't know, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation or the DAAD, I don't know.
Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Yeah.
Okay, good. That's what I thought, but I was not sure. This started a common interest in colloid physics, which lasted several decades and is still going on, although Constance is no longer involved. But Gerhard Nägele and, to a smaller part, also Jan Dont continue. In the course of time, the co-workers of Magdaleno in Mexico and of myself here in Constance became part of the growing collaboration. Some of the Mexican students and postdocs spent extended periods of time in Constance and vice versa. I remember José Luis Arauz, who also worked experimentally in Georg Maret's group. I remember Alejandro Vizcarra and Honorina Ruiz Estrada, who joined us in Constance already more than 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Olegario Alarcón was more than once in Constance. The person who spent the longest time here in Constance is José Méndez Alcaraz, better known as Pepe Méndez. He not only earned his PhD in Constance, but also found his wife here. The person here in Constance who worked extensively with our Mexican friends, but who also spent several extended visits to Mexico, is Gerhard Nägele. He is the one who also collaborates with Ramon Castañeda, although this interaction has its German source now in Jülich. But if I remember correctly, Ramon's contacts were first to Hans Hennig von Grünberg. What was our prime interest in the early years? The quantities of central interest at the time were the results of static and dynamic scattering experiments. They had to be understood in terms of properties of the constituents of the system, that is the number, density, shape, charge, and so on of the colloidal particles. The important link between experiment and theory is the representation of the static structure factor as essentially the Fourier transform of the pair correlation function G of R. The calculation of G of R by integral equation methods was of central importance. It was soon clear that most experimentally used samples have an unavoidable amount of polydispersity, not only in size, but also in charge. A few large particles in the system dominate the scattered intensity, and if these large particles carry higher charges than the rest, there is an influence on the microstructure. The long wavelength limit of the static structure factor of a monodispersed system is directly related to the isothermal compressibility and therefore to the thermodynamic properties. We studied in detail how these simple relations change for polydispersed systems. And the major result was that the interpretation of experimental results of scattering experiments on polydispersed samples in terms of theories for monodispersed systems is quite misleading and not allowed. We could actually quantify these errors. The same methods were also applied to mixtures of charged and uncharged colloids. These systems are interesting because of the resulting microstructure and the possibilities of phase separations. If there are large hard spheres and smaller charged particles, the latter will accumulate in the vicinity of the uncharged spheres because they provide a volume of no charges. This change of the microstructure can be considered as an effective one-component system of large particles which repel each other. That gave rise to Pepe Méndez's work in 1999 on the depletion interaction, starting from integral equation theories. At the time, this was an approach to the depletion problem quite different from others. Here we benefited a lot from the contributions by Bruno D'Aguano. Another very fruitful collaboration was based on the experimental results obtained in the group of Professor Weber in Konstanz by Rainer Krause. He had results for static structures and tracer diffusion of mixtures of polystyrene spheres of different radii. I could continue with the list of problems which we discussed and on which we worked together. I will not do that, but I'm convinced that our collaboration over so many years was scientifically successful. What I would like to add here is that besides our scientific work, we learned about the culture and mentality of the other side. I guess that young Mexicans learn more about European culture than we learn about the culture of the people of Mesoamerica. I personally was amazed when I first saw the archaeological sites of Aztecs, Olmecs, Mayas, and so on. On my first visit to Mexico, Magdaleno took me to the pyramids of Teotihuacan and to the giants of Tula. I was fascinated, but I did not understand the meaning of the rather strange-looking creatures which were covering the walls of the temples. When I was back home, I read a few books about a culture which is so different from our traditions going back to the Greeks. What I mean by telling you about this is that because of my job, which made it possible to have a collaboration with people in Mexico, I could widen my horizon in fields which are completely unrelated to science. And this is a byproduct of a scientific collaboration across the Atlantic. It is a very valuable present. It is a privilege of our profession to have these opportunities. Magdaleno, let me finish my recollections. It has only been a recalling of a few selected events. Others, which might also be worthwhile to talk about, are disappearing in the dust of history. 40 years is a long time. As has been said by other speakers before, 70 years is not yet old. And seeing you, as I do right now, in this Zoom meeting, I can only say that you can certainly expect many more years to come. I wish you good health, which is the most important thing. You have been to Constance. You have not only seen our lake, but you have also visited the mountains of the Alps. Should you ever feel that you actually are getting older, remember hiking in the mountains. Getting older is like climbing a mountain. The higher you climb, the more difficult and tiring it becomes. But you are rewarded by having a better view. You see further to enjoy the beauty of nature and of the world around you. And this is what a good life is all about. In this sense, Magdaleno, all the best to you. It was a pleasure to meet you, and I'm grateful for a long-lasting friendship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really want to say that I thank you so much. The moderator is allowing me to respond, so or to say a few comments. Thank you very much for your words and for the care that you put in this presentation and the incredible lucidity of you remember so many things that I cherish, but nevertheless they are hidden among so many things along these 40 years. And but let me say that Luis Fernando Elizondo was mentioning about me regarding you as one of my mentors, and that's the first thing that I want to say. One goes through life and by learning first from the people who went ahead, and that was probably the most fortunate event that happened to me after my return to Mexico, was this meeting in Berlin that you mentioned, in which I also recall that was really interesting, because I had, in those days, I was starting to work on colloids and on the interaction between charged particles in a time that you just mentioned. It was not very highly regarded among physicists working on these problems, but nevertheless, it was so interesting. And with respect to that, a parameter of what was the condition in those days, I was had been hired in the physics department of the Simvestab. And I later knew that the poor faculty there had a terrible trouble and almost a schisma, because half of them thought that I was a bona fide physicist, because they granted me the master's in physics, and also I passed the general examinations for the PhD, which I didn't finish there. And the other half of the people said, well, yeah, but he got a degree in a chemistry department, so he's not a bona fide physicist. So that was the condition in those days. Right now, in many physics departments, we appreciate having people with a completely, the people who know physics, but also have this wider, and that's what you were doing in those 10 years in the 70s. And that's why it was so fortunate to come to Constance. Now, with respect to coming to Constance, as I say, I'm really grateful to you, to the University in Constance, to life that put things in the same time and so on. One of the things that I mostly appreciate was not only the science. I will continue talking about science, but I want to stop with respect to the human aspects. You open not only the physics department and the university and the world of interactions and networking, which I appreciate, but also you open the doors of your home to receive us as a family. Here is with me Elvira, that you probably remember.
Hello.
For you, thank you. I'm so happy to see you again.
Nice to see you.
And so these kind of things we profoundly cherish in our hearts. And my daughter Rocio and son Hector probably are connected, and they are hearing. So from the human and familiar point of view, we are so grateful for that year. We still remember anything about our living in Jakob Burckhardt was the name of the street. And okay.
Actually, if I might interrupt you.
Yeah.
The address of where we live now is Jakob Burckhardt.
Oh. Yeah. Anyway, that was all of these aspects. We could talk about that a lot. But then I also want to focus on something that for me scientifically was, first of all, the fellowship was an extremely generous fellowship. And it gave us one full year of forgetting about any difficulties and just focus on working in a very stimulating environment. And I remember that allowed me to write one of the most important papers that I wrote, most important in my career, a paper that I presented in the Faraday discussions in 87. And that paper, I remember having written it in the office in the physics department, and in my in the space in that apartment in Jakob Burckhardt. This starting to use this approach of generalized Langevin equation, and that started a whole process that still continues, and all of that was possible because of the atmosphere, the ambience, and of those years, and let's say of being in your group, and also of being in the Simvestab, which was a wonderful place to work. And I remember having received you and Gerhard Nägele in visits in Mexico City. You just mentioned some of them. I would also like to recall some almost at the end of this period in the Sinvestab in 1990. That was probably the last official visit of yours in that program of collaboration. And having you in Mexico City, we wanted to squeeze your stay and give us as many lectures and interactions. And we asked you to give a short course on statistical mechanics of colloidal systems or something like that. And I don't know if you remember that we went to visit Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana Iztapalapa, and our host there was Roberto Alexander Katz, and he used to be also collaborating with the company in Mexico, with the company that does adhesives and many other products, and there you came very much as an advisor with respect to their processes. I didn't come to that visit, and it must have been quite nice, but that illustrated, let's say, the very close contact that statistical physics could have with other branches like engineering and so on, and with the productive activities. And that was, let's say, learning by the example, and that happened. But the other thing is that Roberto Alexander, we also asked him to give a series of lectures on the experimental side. And then we didn't call it at the beginning, but later we called that the first
summer school or something.
Encuentro de fluidos complejos, complex fluid meeting. And those complex fluid meetings still continue with life. I organized them, let's say, or was involved in the organization for the first 24 years. The first one was exactly in that year. The second one took place now in San Luis Potosí, and that's where it continued for almost 20 years. And later on, Olegario Alarcón and other people picked it up, because I decided that I also wanted, organizing things became, let's say, consuming, and I wanted to focus on my own work and more intensively. But other people picked it up, and that event is still going into its 32nd. Ramon, do you recall what is the last issue that you guys organized? Or would somebody remember that? Anyway, we are in almost the 32nd or so edition, but the very first one didn't have the name, but it was the first one, and that was occasion. And I wanted to mention that because that is something very valuable in our community, because that provided us a bridge to communicate with the international community and among ourselves. And you probably were not aware, but you were one of the initiators. and so anyway, we could go on the relationship between Constance and later on the German community has continued and has matured. It is really now a very strong, with many different points in Germany, with points in Mexico, with clear leaders that are emerging, and that is probably something that I'm extremely happy about. And I wanted to share it with you because you were also responsible for this. So anyway,
I only did what I like to do.
I know.
This is also a privilege, and you have to be really a lucky guy in order to live essentially a life where you can do what you like.
You are correct. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And that is probably another thing that having mentors like you and our community has been extremely fortunate to have been close to very generous people. And by the way, you were instrumental to have this contact with so many people, because it was through you that I met Phil Pincus. And Phil Pincus, for example, became an extremely generous, enthusiastic supporter and great friend of the Mexican community. I cannot yeah, I can say probably some people who were formed by this link with Phil. And besides Phil, Sao-Sin Chen, who unfortunately passed away very recently, I met him right in Constance. And he was also somebody who I owe him so many advices, incredibly. And he was so straightforward, and so he was an experimentalist. I remember he telling me sometimes almost angry, but why do you calculate things that you cannot measure? and he was right. And one has all the time, a theorist must always be aiming at explaining something that you can measure. And that advice, I had it in a really loud way from Sao-Sin Chen, whom I met in Constance. Another person that Luis was mentioning a while ago is Alice Gast.
Yes.
She was an extraordinary person who made really beautiful contributions to colloid science. Yeah. And she was also a great friend of the Mexican community, even after she started to serve as a functionary of the president of the university in Lehigh and so on. She always kept very, very closely interested on what was going on in Mexico. And so anyway, from these goings and from all these interactions, now I think that our community has, is not the difference is tremendous between what happened in the early 80s.
Yeah.
I always said in Mexico, this is a field in which Mexico is not entering with any delay, because we were starting to do the science that was starting to be done everywhere in the world. Okay, it was very tiny contribution. Now the community is really much more complex and maturing, and that is really quite nice. So anyway, just wanted to say I thank you for your mentorship, your friendship, and your scientific contributions to the Mexican community, in particular to my own 40 years of work as a scientist, and we hope to keep this, and I'm sure that it will continue through this energetic and vigorous and creative new generations. So I think that I should stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Professor Klein, anything else to add to your contribution, or perhaps someone in the audience close to this relationship as Gerhard Nägerle or Stefan, that was very excited about this comment of Magdalena of things that should be calculated by theoreticians? I saw your reaction, so I guess. But Gerhard, please.
Let me add one thing. I mean, I mentioned that shortly in my presentation, that this interdisciplinary character of our research, of what we did, that was really a very important aspect. You know, we as physicists, we have certain tools, theoretical and experimental. But to be successful, you also have to have good systems, well-characterized systems. You have to rely on people who can make samples in a controlled way. And this is often not so easy for physicists because we are not educated in this way. So we have to rely, for instance, in material science or so, we have to rely on people from other fields, chemistry in this case. And this is something which is certainly true, very true, in soft condensed matter, much more than in nuclear physics or astronomy or something like that, that we have to rely and we have to collaborate with people who come from outside physics. And that is important. And I think that soft condensed matter physics can contribute outside of physics. Yeah, I mean, with all these recent developments, extensions of what we used to do 30 years ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really something very important. That's what I wanted to add.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Klein. I think Gerhard has a comment as well.
Yes, well, in my presentation, I will show some pictures which are underpinning the time Professor Klein was talking about. So I don't want to show them now because I don't want to steal the thunder of my own talk. But I would like to add a remark about Bücklistraße, which was the place where Magdaleno spent his year as a Humboldt Fellowship together with Professor Klein and us. And just to explain, this was a very special place, actually. We were a relatively small faculty with people working on very different topics, from general relativity down or up to complex fluids. And we had one coffee room, a very nicely prepared coffee room with plants. One secretary was taking care of that. And everybody was meeting there, professors, students, everybody was meeting there. And it was a very inspiring place to be, because we were not just talking about science there. I remember that Rudolf Klein liked to talk about climbing the mountains, and I remember you were a specialist in rocks. So you were explaining to us the different types of rocks which were good for climbing and not good for climbing. And then we started to discuss from a physicist's point of view if this is true or not true, and how the rocks have to be optimal for a mountain climber. So it was all these type of discussions, and all the persons you mentioned, Magdaleno, like So-Sin Chen. I also remember Sia Akchazu at that time, and others. They all were sharing their ideas in this coffee room.
Harry Frisch.
Harry Frisch was there, exactly.
Yeah.
Many people. I think even Alice Guest was there once during a workshop which she had organized in honor of your 60th birthday. And actually, she told me there at that time that she was pregnant and was expecting her first baby. I still recall that. So it was great.
So, and don't forget Theo Odijk.
Theo Odijk, oh, that was a remark. Maybe, and you should tell that. You should tell that. That's a special occasion.
So you did. So you tell that again.
No, you tell that. That you have to tell that. Go ahead.
No, this is too much. So he is quite a character, and he did some things that are too bad to tell here. So I will leave it to that. If you want to tell the details, you can go ahead, but I won't.
No, I don't. No, I mean, he was.
You now have to share those details with the audience.
I think you can share them after a few beers, but not earlier. Well, he was special. I will also remember that we had Bogdan Chikotsky from University of Warsaw as a visitor. I think there was also overlap between you and Bogdan, right?
Oh yeah.
And he was also a little bit quite a character. I would call him kind of a Polish Wolfgang Pauli. He was extremely critical about everything we did, right? And
I don't think that there was something that pleased him at any time.
Well, actually,
it was great.
Let me add a remark with regard to Chikotsky. The University of Constance made an official treaty with the University of Warsaw, because as long as the Iron Curtain existed, scientists from East Europe, so Poland, for instance, they could not, in general, travel to the West, even if they had an invitation. So it would have been impossible to get Chikotsky to Germany. So, but having such a treaty, an official relation between the Polish university and the German university, that was possible. And that situation only changed after the breakdown of the Iron Curtain. So that was after 1990. But before that, we had to have these very weird treaties. Yeah, and I was a member of a 3-man delegation of our university, and to travel to Warsaw in 1985 to actually sign this treaty. And so what in connection with that, the 3 of us, we went to different departments and introduced our university to our Polish colleagues. I mean, these are really strange things if you consider them on this time scale, yeah, of 30, 35 years. Things were very different, and many things were very difficult to actually realize. And that, excuse me, Gerhard Nägele, that I interrupted you, but I think here again, it might be of interest to the younger people here in the audience to at least hear about this once. And now I'm quiet.
You're right. I mean, I remember this because he was sharing his office with me, together with, at that time, a colleague of mine, Ulrike Gens, both heavily smokers, by the way, at that time. And we had quite often discussion about politics. So this was before the downfall of the Iron Curtain, as you mentioned. And I was quite impressed and surprised that Bogdan was very open about the political situation in Poland and the rule of communism there. I mean, something I would not have expected, because, I mean, from having met people from East Germany at that time, they tried to avoid it to be too explicit about their, say, disdain about the political system there. But he was really open, and he also told me and us that Poland was different. I mean, it was a strongly Catholic country, it still is, and that the people were really critical about the system, and they were openly expressing that. This was really impressive, something I wouldn't have expected at that time.
Gerhard, although it's sort of related about Bogdan Chikotsky, Polish, being in Constance, and we had a Bogdan in our Simbestad. You probably remember Bogdan Mielnik. He was also.
Yes.
We could say similar things about Bogdan Mielnik, and you met him. He was a faculty in the physics department in the Simbestad, and Chikotsky. These guys had a really tremendous education in mathematics. For me, talking with Bogdan Mielnik, that I did very often in the Simbestad, it was just great, because if I had any question with respect to mathematics, I always came to Bogdan Mielnik. And most of the times I had the answer, but if not, I had some answer to another thing, but always got something, because these people were really, and the same, I remember Bogdan Mielnik because of Bogdan Chikotsky, and again, since you met him, I thought that it was a pertinent mention.
I remember there was an American professor at that time, right?
Yeah, Bill Watson.
Was right, and he was drinking a lot of coffee and smoking a lot, and the two of them had permanent discussions. And I during the time when I was sharing the office, because the Polish was anti-communist, and no, how was that? And the American was communist. So in a you're right.
It was a left-wing kind of guy, and Bogdan was, as many Polish, just they have this gene of hating Russians, like Mexicans have a gene of not hating, but in the folklore, not liking Americans. And
I like Rudolf very much. I mean, I think Russell was a Vietnam vet, right? He went to the Vietnam War, and he had a very husky voice. And when they were talking science, then you could hear the very high-pitched voice of Bogdan Mielnik explaining something. And at the end, he would give something like, see. And then Russell would reply, oh, I see. And this was what we could hear. And Alejandro constantly made jokes about them. He was kind of repeating that. But the two didn't mind. They liked that. And it was really funny about them. Yeah.
As everybody can see, Gerhard was not only a guest, he was also a member of the physics department in Mexico City.
He's still.
Well, I think it was more than 10 times went to Mexico.
Guys, I'm sorry to interrupt. So some sort of very nice remembering and so on, but it is time for Thomas Voigtmann to contribute here. But we can, I mean, later on you can continue up to this point. And I think we need to make a pause, right, Christina? So you can start the new recording and so on. This is what I think that it's just 1 minute.
Yes, we have like 10 more minutes.
No, then I'm sorry. I thought it was, so sorry to interrupt. I think also Stefan wanted to say something, and probably Jan also now that, no, I misunderstood. Jan, I think I also interrupted you. Do you think you want to contribute a little bit with Gerhard and Magdalena's remembering?
Well, so the idea was that I would tell something about Theo Oudijk, but really that is too embarrassing to do. So things happen that you don't tell so on YouTube.
Okay, but you are about to retire anyway.
So did you ever meet Theo Oudijk, Magdalena? So did you ever meet him?
With Theo Oudijk? I met him. We coincided in meetings, but not in Constance when he was there. So I don't know anything about that story.
So let me just say that I learned how to drink tequila from Magdalena with so a citron. So how do you call this in English? And so it's salt, right? So you put salt on your hand.
Lemon. Mm-hmm.
So lemon, and then drink it. And I remember that I was pretty drunk afterwards. And that is one of the few, so of the many nice things I remember, being drunk after drinking tequila with Magdalena.
Okay, now that you mentioned about not exactly getting drunk, I would like to mention something that was I always remember very warmly, and that was that Gerhard, Jan, and myself would stay until very late in Buckelstrasse. When it moved to this, in this out before going to the new building in Buckelstrasse. So we had to come back through. What was the name of the street, Martin? I don't remember. This long street that came from Buckelstrasse to downtown in Constance.
Wollmattinger
Straße. And in between, there was a bar, King's Arms. Do you remember, Gerhard? Of course you remember, because we stopped every day or every night. We stopped there for a beer.
Yeah, and we always ate the same thing, an Argentinische roomsteak.
Yeah, I know. So anyway, just to add to your recalling of drinking tequila is also that you took us to King's Arm. Not you took us, but we went there every night, and that was really great. That was great conversations and great sharing.
Yeah, and the owner of this pub was a Dutch lady, and she knew after 2 times so going there that I was Dutch. So every time that we came there, we had free schnapps in the beginning.
Yeah.
So before the Argentinische roomsteak.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, Luis.
Okay. Does anybody else want to contribute? No, no. Christy told us that we have still around 5 minutes. Perhaps, no, I think Stefan, no, he doesn't. So perhaps, Gerhard, do you want to share your last?
Well, actually, I want to say something during my talk. Yeah, I mean, there are many memories, good memories of Bücklistraße. And as I said, it was especially on the inside, very great atmosphere, very, I would say, interdisciplinary atmosphere, which was born out of the fact that so many different scientists were meeting at the same place, working on very different topics. And still we could communicate a lot. And I mean, I remember I think Harry Frisch is an American chemist who published enormous number of papers. I don't recall 700, 800. I happen to have one with him, with Professor Klein, one out of 800. And I remember that he came once in a while, and then he was extremely knowledgeable, and he had a photographic memory. So he knew exactly his papers, his 800 papers, what was in there. And I remember that he wrote his papers in the coffee room. So he would come look around in the Bücklistraße coffee room. Also my paper. Also he wrote a paper with Walter Hess, which was basically written in half a day or a day, sitting in, well, he was of course very good in English, naturally. And he was sitting in the coffee room writing papers. I mean, within a day or so.
Actually, I remember that Harry Frisch came to me asking whether we could write a paper together. And then I explained what I was doing. And then he said, this will take too much time, and he left.
Yeah.
Not the half-day coffee room time. Yeah.
In the early times of the liquid state physics, I remember people of my generation remembers this thick book edited by Frisch and Lebowitz on that was sort of the introduction. There was no Hansen and McDonald, McCrory, or anything like that. And then you had to go directly to the papers by Perkus and so on. And that was, I don't know, people of my generation remembers that. I don't know if the younger people have even heard about that. And Harry Frisch was one of the compilers.
Have you been in Constance when Perkus visited us and gave a presentation? No? Yeah, and you recall it, right, Professor Klein? You recall the visit of Perkus.
Yes, so he came in Bahama shorts because he had a holiday there in Constance. So he collected 500 marks at that time. And after his talk in Bahama shorts, he left.
Yeah.
You know, but he gave an impressive talk because he did the talk out of his memory, just with chalk. He didn't have prepared any transparencies. He just wrote down his many equations onto the blackboard. So that, in a sense, it was, of course, a scurril visit because he looked like he was going to the beach. Only the camera was missing, hanging around his head. But the talk itself was very impressive. Very impressive.
Oh, that's nice. I mean.
I also recall the visit of a Nobel laureate to Constance. I also don't know, Magdalena, if you have been there. Magdalena, you remember well. Jan, you remember well, right?
Sir Neville Mott.
Sir Neville Mott. Maybe you explain it now.
Yeah.
That's a story for you.
Well, he had a very fancy jacket, a suit. So contrary to Perkus. And at some point, he unbuttoned his jacket, and then it turned out that he had his Unterhosen. So how do you call this in English?
Underpants.
His underpants over his shirt, up to his waist here. So halfway, he pulled his white underpants up to there. And no one dared to say anything because he was Sir Neville Mott.
Yeah.
So we were all, so in the back, we were all silently laughing. And all the professors in front were very serious looking at his underpants. So it was-
I'm sorry, just make a comment. You guys look exactly the way you used to look then, always laughing at any detail like this. Great.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Gerhard. I think now it's, according to the organizers, it is time to change to the new session and also the recording. So, well, one more time, Professor Klein, thank you very much for your very nice talk, and all you guys for these nice rememberings. And perhaps we can just share an applause, a virtual applause to everyone. I think someone, Thomas, what is